Good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Dorrity from University College Cork, and I'm going to be chairing today's session. It's a great pleasure to introduce this session, Health and Environmental Security, and our three speakers, Professor John Morrissey from the University of Galway, Mr. Barry Guihen, who's an independent researcher, and Dr. Mina Hosseini from University College Dublin. So our first speaker, Professor John Morrissey, the title of his presentation is The Task of Writing Security for the Anthropocene. So just in relation to some information about John, for those of you who don't know about him, his research is concerned with overlapping issues of geopolitics, security and international development. He has written extensively in this area, and he was also appointed the director of the Moore Institute for Humanities and Social Studies in 2015. He has also been a visiting fellow for the Australian National University in 2023. He has been an international consultant on human security for the United Nations in 2021. He was a visiting scholar at St. Anthony's College in Oxford in 2019. He has also received the President's Award for Teaching Excellence in NUI Galway, and has also been a visiting scholar at Leeds University in Rome. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to John for our first speaker.
Claire, thank you very much. It's way too kind. Just to begin, as I'm on the Standing Committee for International Affairs, just a big thank you to all the staff here at the Royal Irish Academy, particularly to Vanessa, to Sharon, work in the background. This is such an important portal for us as academics. What Conor was talking about, instead of speaking to ourselves, we're speaking outside, and you do really, really important work, and we're very, very grateful for that. So I've been working on questions of security and its connections to imperialism, geographical knowledge, interventionism more broadly, and international development for the best part of 20 years. I've been thinking a lot about how do we frame, as requiring security measures, the importance of scripting, in other words. Because security is ultimately about defining and describing the problem with a view to shaping the response. And in that, representation is absolutely critically important. And I think the early colonial antecedents, again, what Conor and Jerry spoke about in the first session, are really, really vital here. And we need to really not just historicize that, but also bring it into view. Early 17th century Ireland, if you go down the road to the Calendar State Papers in Ireland, you'll find writers like Edmund Spencer and others writing about, quote, "Write the world you want to see," from 1598. Again, echoing Jerry's point about making the world as we see fit. So how do some securitization discourses become established or hegemonic? Well, we just need to look at how it's scripted. So the book on the left here is a critique of CENTCOM, which is the biggest command in the US military, the 9th biggest economy in the world, an enormously resourced institution that constantly script what it is that they do. If you go to the Library of Congress and you find the posture statements every single year justifying essentially what the interventionary strategy is, these are the phrases that you find. Three most common are guardians of the Gulf, that's what we are. Stability for global markets, second most used phrase. And finally, good of the global economy. You won't find better universalist logics and registers of securitization than that. So how do we inflect? And these are the questions that Claire and I and other colleagues working on migration in the Mediterranean context have been thinking about, is how do we inflect wider concerns of human priorities into that hegemonic knowledge, power knowledge couplet of interventionism? How do we insist upon environmental precarities? How do we insist upon support for civil society security more broadly? Well, as CENTCOM commanders very, very often reminded me, and they always treated me like some kind of an alien when I was interviewing them, we don't have, quote, actionable intelligence on that, is what they repeatedly said to me. They don't have actionable intelligence. So I think there's a really big need, and this echoes in many ways some of the concerns of the first speakers. A need for cohering actionable expertise. I don't want to use a full military neologism here, in setting out wider security visions. Because we do have expertise. We do have knowledge. Every gauge of planetary well-being alerts us to our anthropogenic insecurities. Carbon emissions, temperature rise, ozone depletion, deforestation, etc., etc. These and other human-induced environmental stresses have been mirrored in recent decades by an escalation in infectious zoonotic diseases, of which COVID-19 was just one. The Anthropocene is a very appropriate name for our current epoch. We have been relentlessly transgressing all 9 of the Earth's ecosystem planetary boundaries since 2003, when ecological surplus was surpassed, as Jason Moore has so brilliantly shown. And the planetary pressures and ensuing global insecurities are only growing. So, these global insecurities were the focus of the UNDP special report, which was mentioned earlier, New Threats to Human Security in the Anthropocene. I was involved a little bit in this, and it was really, really important for us to outline the range of overlapping human environmental security concerns in the Anthropocene, mirroring the 7 original overarching human environmental components of human security, ranging from food security all the way to political security. The report is very much at pains to re-stress the importance of addressing them holistically with activated networks of solidarity and cooperation. And I think in seeking to reframe security responses, it underlines, and this is absolutely crucial, the role of legal and regulatory mechanisms in curbing the ecological excesses of late modern capitalism. And in challenging narrow, statist and unilateral formulations of security, the report brings into view the global interconnections of security the world now faces, from climate security to food security, from military security to health security. And finally, the last thing that the report does, I think, is it reads critically as a vectoring of human and environmental insecurities, COVID-19. Now, has COVID-19, is such a big question, elicited enough reflection on the wider set of overlapping human environmental crises to have an impact on the way in which we define and frame security for our interconnected world? Can we strategize anew, in other words, for a new sense of conjoined or a renewed sense of human environmental security that is essential for the sustaining challenge of planet Earth? Global human environmental security is about shared interests and can only be attained by acting collectively, responsibly, and cooperatively. We certainly need to insist, I think, upon the planet's transnational human and environmental precarities and detail how we need to address them holistically, more of which I'll talk about hopefully in a second. The Anthropocene's polycrises are interconnected and affect every nation, from forced population displacements to multiple threats to ecosystems, climate change more broadly, the rise in zoonosis and pollution, and so on. So I think a core task is the reframing understandings of security with a wider lens, with a view to activating ultimately more environmentally and ethically attuned forms of governance. Okay, I'm going to try and talk about 5, no, it's missing the text, but I'm going to try and talk about 5 aspects of scripting security and governance for the Anthropocene. The first is the task of documenting the ecological excesses of capitalism. When you look and you historicize this story, what you find is that warnings of the dangers of overstepping planetary boundaries is in no way new. It's been fully aware in scientific circles since the 1930s. The idea of global warming, for example, has been present since then. And the WHO has persistently warned of the connections between climate change, habitat degradation, and human health. exposing the destructive planetary effects of deregulated capitalism, and deregulation is a key thing here, gets us much closer to cohering an alternative vision for human environmental health. And one of the most important economic, ecological connections to illuminate relates to big pharma agribusiness, which sits at the very nexus of food security, ecological disruption, human health, and infectious disease. The second task, I think, is transcending the hegemony of military security. Let me see if this works one more time. No, it doesn't. Bullet points lost. Anyway, the second bullet point is transcending the hegemony of military security. This is an enormous task. Why has human security, in other words, as a progressive discourse of interventionism, not had more of an impact? Why has it not productively informed countries' foreign and domestic policies on security, cooperation of an international dimension, solidarity, and so on? Briefly, there are two primary reasons, I think. The first is a long history of an interstate version of foreign policy in which military actors and national security concerns have set the agenda. States, in other words, have across the world invested in the political economy of conflict for a very long time. Jerry's point about the arms trade being just one. The second reason, and this is often overlooked, I think, is the prioritized economic agendas of particularly global North governments since World War II. Now, the UK Disruptive Review has shown this in forensic detail. The pushback against anything of concern in relation to sustainable nature strategies and so on is enormous in the UK, and has been consistently. And again, I think we need to historicize and insist upon that history, because we are where we are today in terms of deregulation because of those consistent strategies of, in this case, the UK government in relation to the erasure of questions of nature in the whole conceiving of development since at least World War II. And these work to exclude nature from the predominant modelling of economic development plans that emerged. Okay, the third task, I think, is about showcasing, and this is really crucial, it's about showcasing the import of solidarity and cooperation. And really brilliant questions in the earlier session about concrete examples of, and I'm going to try and address that because it's so important to showcase and tell stories of successful alternative visions, alternative subjectivities that work. Because imagining a new and better world involves, yes, on the one hand, carefully documenting and understanding the dysfunctions of the old, but on the other, it's about creatively envisioning a greater vision of security for the present and future. In transitioning to, hopefully, a more responsible living and governing of the planet, considerations of justice, social and environmental, as Lorraine so brilliantly outlined, solidarity and cooperation are vital. And we need to showcase success stories where these have been proven to count. I'm just going to give two. One such success, first of all, can be found in the Caribbean, where the extension of Cuba's risk reduction management centers across the region via the Caribbean Risk Management Initiative is enormously successful, has been central in efforts to tackle pan-national climate insecurities. My colleague Yaran Colombe and I in UCC have been working on this for a few years. It's really inspiring. It's a story that needs to be told. The initiative's establishment in 2004 deployed many of the core elements of the UN's human security vision, especially its emphasis on the scalar implementation of locally attuned environmental knowledges and practices. Again, to Lorraine's point about a really good example of how do you activate human security? Well, then you meaningfully invoke and organize the possibility of participation. You map differently. You measure differently. You bring into view a series of knowledges and practices that can make a difference. The initiative comprises, for example, in Caribbean briefly, preparedness plans that require local knowledge is being mobilized into administrative systems at regional, national, and transnational levels. And the crucial thing in all of that is they resource it. They move money away to that area. They say that counts. We have to administratively resource that, and they have done that enormously successful. Look at the deaths from weather events in the Caribbean from 2004, and you'll see that statistic being borne out so inspiringly. I think its success showcases the possibility of bottom-up actual climate resilience, and there's so much, very, very, like superficial invocations, as Jerry talked about, of phrases like resilience and participation and so on. This is actual climate resilience from the bottom up. Participatory knowledges are integrated into an organized system of environmental custodianship. It is a clear example, I think, of a highly functioning transnational human environmental security framework, a different way of thinking about security. Other examples, quickly, include ASEAN's cooperative climate security initiatives in Southeast Asia, which Lorraine Elliott has written about. Japan's recent establishment of the tsunami preparedness plans post-2015, all based on the successful Caribbean model. Okay, two things quickly. Measuring security success and well-being. The task of envisioning, this is a really crucial task, I think. The task of envisioning security differently needs to be matched to how we measure security. What are the indicators we elevate and value? Well, the UNDP's most recent HDR, which Pedro Conceição was hugely instrumental in overseeing, is encouraging in its move towards a planetary pressures-adjusted human development index, which classifies a country's development not simply in terms of GDP, but additionally in terms of carbon emissions and resource use per person. In steering a path away from the destructive rudiments of late modern capitalism, revising how we measure success, prosperity, and well-being in ways other than econocentric modeling is critical, I think. In the task of adjusting metrics, Indigenous rights perspectives and the locally led generation and mapping of data is also crucial. And governments everywhere need to pay close attention, much closer attention to the degrowth concept, there's no doubt about that, which seeks to meaningfully reduce global economic production and consumption in a strategy of ecological and social sustainability in which human and environmental well-being replaces GDP as a metric of success and prosperity. Okay, the final thing, quickly, is the challenge of activating responsibility. The challenge of activating accountability and regulation, absolutely vital. And is it ameliorative? Conor, I'm thinking about this even as I'm delivering this. I think there are ways in which we can hold regulatory bodies to account for what their purpose is to serve. Because in reframing and re-envisioning security, governing responsibilities, mechanisms of regulation are absolutely key. So how do we activate binding frameworks of responsibility and accountability, for example? Well, it seems to me that marshalling existing elements of the existing law, first of all, is really important. A good example of that is just a few months ago, late 2022, the European Commission released a draft proposal to restrict added microplastics to products. Now, that proposal was built on a very, very long campaign identifying the overlapping human and environmental threats. In this conjoined human environmental security vision, of course, two challenges remain. The first is the political economic opposition from vested manufacturing interests. If you Google that law, or that draft that just come in, all you get is the opposition, by the way, to the law being brought in the first place, because it's just a cheaper form of economic production that corporations are up in arms about. So that's the first challenge that we face, there's no doubt about that. And the other is the effective administration of the governing law. And I think that requires the European Commission, in particular in the European Union, and there's plans afoot in this capacity to require regulatory and crucially punitive measures that will politically and economically persuade corporations and states that compliance is in their interests. There are other governmental tools of regulation and incentivization. Briefly, activating financial regulatory oversight seems to me, as a public entity, a really crucial one. And here we can learn from the global south. We're so obsessed with ourselves in the global north that we rarely look outside to see what has been successful. Indonesia, for example, from 1998 onwards, has empowered its public entity, its central bank, to oversee every form of urban development with a whole series of green requirements in its development. And it's been hugely successful. Attaching stringent sustainability requirements into pricing carbon initiatives. And Indonesia was the first to do it. Introducing green supporting and brown penalizing factors in capital investments. Compelling minimum amounts of green assets to be retained on financial institutions' balance sheets and so on. overseeing incentives more broadly to protect biodiversity through market mechanisms, and instigating specific financial mechanisms to scale up nature-based solutions in particular. And of course, there are broader global networks, regulatory frameworks, including the Sendai framework and Paris Agreement, which we need very much to be conscious of as well. All of these mechanisms are in effect security mechanisms that will get us closer to governing ethically in a prioritized understanding of human and environmental health. But it is about resourcing. Their resourcing and activation are key to regulating more environmentally the destructive economic modalities of late modern capitalism. We simply can no longer accede to the fables of neoliberalism, such as the idea of perpetual economic growth, falsely promissory as an idea, of course, so rarely politically challenged. Such neoliberal discourses serve profit more than people, finance certainly more than health, and presentism, crucially, more than future. Okay, last slide really quickly then. Framing and disseminating a globally interconnected human environmental sense of security is vital to establishing a path towards a healthier and more sustainable planet. Securitization, the writing of security, the discursive production of security, is ultimately about prioritizing governmental resources to particular kinds of insecurity that have won out as part of the story. This is the central story. This is what we have prioritized. We must compellingly script big picture narratives of planetary precarity and its complex interconnections. We certainly need to showcase, I think, how we need to act in solidarity and cooperation in scalar integrated responses to polycrisis and why we need to resource them. We must activate the necessary legal and regulatory mechanisms in security policy, where they exist and where we need to extend them. And we must be attendant, I think, as well, to the indices of success upon which security is measured and resourced. As a final point, seeing as we're in the Royal Irish Academy, on the role of intellectual leadership, I think it's absolutely crucial that we increasingly work to inflect arts, humanities, and social science perspectives into understandings, in this specific case, of security, and how, for example, research funding is devised and supported. If we look at current European Commission funding on security, for example, we find it's completely dominated by statist formulations of security, concerns of surveillance, repeatedly, bordering, population management, prioritized issues of population security, all of which occlude completely questions of human security. Research calls are typically framed in the language of technocratic security solutions and are simplistic, beyond simplistic, in their presentist design and orientation. And finally, that battle continues, of course. In the Irish Government's Research and Innovation Bill 2023, just published a key document for the future of research funding in Ireland, in which innovation and research are envisioned and linked. The word science features 44 times. 44. The words arts, humanities, and social science features once. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, John. That was really interesting. Vanessa had tasked me with this 2-minute reminder, and just as John began his presentation, I realized I don't have my phone with me. But I guess in the interest of fairness, I have to continue as I started. So thank you, John. That was a really interesting presentation, and I really like the way you raised the issue about the global north and the global south. I was in Mexico last year, and there are streets ahead of us in relation to green solutions. So thank you very much, John, and that has raised lots of really interesting questions. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker now, and this is Barry Guihen. And Barry is an independent researcher with an educational background and professional experience of examining security and human rights policy. He has also been contracted in the past to assist in editing and redrafting material for online consultation as part of the Horizon 2020 project, about mechanisms for knowledge-based policy advice on smart specialisation. He has also assisted in the organisation and running of the Computers, Privacy and Data Protection Conference in 2017 in Brussels. And he has also been part of the Centre for Science, Society and Citizenship and was a leading European independent researcher at the centre. So I'm not going to introduce, the title is From Securing Health to Enabling Wellbeing Towards a More Holistic View of Addressing Global Health Challenges. And rather than telling you what his presentation is about in the interest of time, I'll hand over straight to Barry to introduce himself and his presentation. Thank you, Barry.
Thanks very much. If you'll indulge me for 1 second, I've stood at too many microphones looming over them. Can you all hear me with this? Perfect. So, yep, my name is Barry Guihen, and I'm presenting today on securing health and enabling well-being. So, I'm going to speak a little bit about why health is special. I'm going to talk about the intrinsic value of health before moving on to discuss how the security frameworks that we have shaped our approach to health challenges in the 21st century and why they're limiting us and how we can perhaps move beyond that as we advance. So, health is important because it's intrinsically a part of how we go about our daily lives. It enables us to participate in society, and it is a universal kind of constant throughout the entire population. It's something that we all value, and it's something that affects every other part of our lives as well. And it's for that reason that it's important to kind of not lose sight of that intrinsic value of health. And that can be lost sometimes when we talk about securing health, particularly when we look at it from the statist perspective, as we've heard already today, in which health is secured as a means through which to secure either the status quo or to secure the state's interest rather than the individuals or communities. So I think at a very basic point, it's important to recall, first of all, the fundamental and intrinsic value of health to each individual, each community, and each then network beyond that as well, before we continue. It really grounds everything. What we've also heard today is that there has been an escalation in health crises, particularly in the last couple of decades. There has been an increasing number of kind of health security challenges as the world has become increasingly globalized. As we've become increasingly connected, we've also become increasingly subject to or a part of threat to global health in travel and in how we live. Here we have some of the major kind of 21st century health crises, as you can see. They'll be familiar to anyone who's paid attention, I think, to the news in the last 20 years, certainly in the more recent years. To give you some of the numbers, I mean, H1N1, 500,000 confirmed cases in the beginning of the century. Confirmed, that is, millions actually an estimate, not to mention the 18,500 confirmed deaths. That's one of the higher ends of it. Ebola, MERS, SARS, they all have, been called on as security crises in their moment and then dropped off as the next health challenge emerged. The only problem with the slide is that it's not only wrong, it's barely right, because in reality, I mean, health challenges, they don't just disappear and reappear. They're not discrete critical events, or at least usually not. And they're also not strictly the events that have been securitized to the critical point in the last 20, 30 odd years. This slide, I think, hopefully gives some kind of sense of just how messy this all is and how these all interact and overlap. The fact that, in Zika, we think of Zika 2016, the Olympics, it was very much in the headlines. But Zika never went away. We just stopped paying attention outside of where it is locally active. The threat receded, at least as far as we imagined it to. But the reality of the disease is still there. It still exists, and it's still a very real part of the populations in Brazil and in other parts of South America where this is still a going concern. Likewise, with securitization of health, you get a very, very strong and overly myopic focus at times on communicable diseases. But you'll see on the slide, I mean, many of these health challenges that we face today, despite the fact that they've not been securitized, they're very, very real. Obesity, malaria, neglected tropical diseases. I think that the key is in the term neglected there. And to give you some kind of better sense of how these health challenges lay out, the Global Burden of Disease Project, for those of you who are familiar, kind of gives a good sense of the scale of the health challenges that we face globally, as you might imagine. And as you go down through the list, as you scan it, you'll see some that are familiar from news headlines, from securitization actions, and others which are familiar just through daily life. You know, the very top of the list there is cardiovascular diseases. And it continues down through obesity, respiratory illnesses, cancers. You know, these are not typically illnesses, health challenges that we associate with securitization narratives, with threats to the status quo, with paradigm shifts. But they do present very, very real threats, very, very real challenges that must be addressed at a global level, certainly cannot be addressed at a national level individually. The other issue is, as we have seen this escalation of securitized health threats, we've seen this increased frequency of securitization narratives where they begin to start to mismatch in how they're applied. So originally you see securitization narratives applied specifically where there's high levels of fatality, where there's unknown risks, you know, new emerging diseases, new emerging illnesses. But you start to see that change in the last couple of years, the last decade and a half. For example, Zika, it's not a fatal illness. Its securitization response was charged by the fact that its impact was unknown at the time. And securitization, unfortunately, also had the problem of burdening those infected with the disease or those most at risk of the disease, in this case women, with having to respond to the disease. So the health advice at the time was to shelter in place, to avoid pregnancy if possible, to maintain clean homes. And these are sometimes, in many cases, you know, factors or challenges that you're putting to people that are not necessarily fully within one's own capabilities or control, depending on outside circumstances, completely divorced of biomedical definitions of health and health states. You know, if you look at Ebola in West Africa in the 2014, 2015, it was, again, a highly, highly publicized event, presented as a severe security threat. It was fought like a fire in some respects, where we see, again, images of lockdowns, images of quarantines, of soldiers with medical supplies. The problem with this was also that it was presented as, again, a discrete crisis event, when in fact there have been dozens of outbreaks of Ebola across Africa in the last decades. And in what's different in each one then is how the narrative around each one is framed. And that unevenness, again, fails to really convey the realness of this threat in this instance, or the importance of, again, recalling that need to respect and protect the intrinsic and fundamental value of health. It became securitized when the threat was deemed to be projected outwards, as opposed to a threat to those who were already living that situation. We see it again with neglected tropical diseases, just to mention that many times the real burden there is in the socioeconomic elements of those diseases. The root causes of them are often there. The inability to address their burdens are again rooted in socioeconomics. So in each of these cases, the context within which each health crisis takes place is very, very important. And that can be both temporal and in terms of location. So you can have, for example, a health crisis event, we all know we just came and are still living through one in many cases, which was experienced in many, many different ways by people living in very familiar and similar locations, purely on the basis of local rules, regulations, family relationships, you know, social relationships, your professional requirements, how you, if you had employment, how you were able to carry out that employment was deeply affected or not, depending on an ability to work remotely, for example, an option that was available to some, but not to many. All of these, again, you know, are factors that can get lost at times in talking about the securitization of health. Now, there we go. This might help, moving on to this slide. So I mentioned in my abstract about the blinkers of health securitization, these limiting factors, and there are a few to mention beyond what I've already raised. But to speak of it in terms of just to put it in terms of international relations for a second, part of the issue with securitization is that it is inherently an adversarial narrative. You are putting it in terms of us versus them. And in many cases, this is acceptable because it's us versus an illness or a disease. But unfortunately, with securitization, and especially as it creeps, that us versus them is not limited or confined to human populations against a pathogen, but it does become about identity as well. And this has happened in cases with recent events such as with the avian flu, the H1N1 or the H5N1 virus, the Indonesia, where this was really the epicenter of it at the time. They stopped sharing viral samples in order to protect their IP in preparation for signing an MOU with Baxter at the time. That was not a medical decision. That was a decision taken, they saw it through need because they perceived this as they perceived the sharing of live samples of the virus as a threat to their own security, because in sharing the virus, the global community then produced vaccines, but the vaccines then were not made initially available on an equitable terms globally. Rather, they were pre-purchased by the countries that could afford them. Indonesia decided to go on their own terms with this, much to the consternation of the international community. We see this again with COVID vaccines. If you remember the outbreak of COVID in Europe, there was the issue with the vaccines between the UK and the EU, and it became a real source of tension at the time, sourcing them and claims of jumping the queue, etc. Again, losing sight of the importance of dealing with the health threat that COVID presented and dealing instead with the politics and the kind of socioeconomic context within which it happened. Finally, crises are competing more and more. And these health crises are not competing just with other health crises. They're also competing with crises in general. And it's almost like a tide where it's in and out. You know, we had one health scare and then it recedes as far as we perceive it, and then there's another. But the tide is coming in so frequently that eventually you're just swimming and you find yourself in a new normal, which is a state of permacrisis, in which case the act of securitization becomes increasingly heightened because you have to continually reset the threat. You have to continually engage, convince, and get that buy-in, both at a political level, at a social level, and right down through the line in order for it to be effective. And as the number of crises and the scale of crises increases, that effectiveness decreases in kind. All of this affects resource allocation and resource priorities. So resource allocation, it's primarily a political decision. It's a decision that is taken on the product of budgets, and it's not absolute, but it does have an absolute in that there are limits to resources. It is fundamentally fungible. They can include medical interventions. They can also include agreements to share data. They can include agreements to share non-medical resources, such as personnel, such as hardware. PPE, for example, is one that is, I think, an acronym that has been burned into our brains in the last couple of years, and one that is a good example of resources that have been shared worldwide. However, to move on then, why well-being, and what do I mean by well-being? Well, by well-being, it's again to return to that idea of health as a fundamental and intrinsic important good. Health securitization, in narrowing it, kind of strips out all of that and forces us into, at oftentimes, zero-sum games, but it also means that you're fighting fires rather than tending to the forest. You're looking for the next outbreak, you're looking for the next crisis to react to, rather than examining the social determinants of health, the economic determinants of health. You know, why does it have to get to a crisis level before the world is spurred to act? And, you know, we can see this with increasing relevance to other diseases. Again, I mean, consider, for example, asthma, and consider the health burden of asthma globally. And depending on where you are in the world, asthma can either be a mild annoyance, or it can be a crippling and debilitating illness that can really prevent you from achieving what you would hope to achieve in life. Again, it's not a securitized disease. It is the subject of a lot of funding, but it doesn't have that same buy-in because it doesn't have that same crisis point. However, just 4 weeks ago, Japan announced a war on pollen. About 60% of Japan suffers from hay fever, and about 80% of those who suffered, they reported a severe drop in productivity as a result of that hay fever. So Japan has announced this year that they're going to war on pollen. And when you look at what they're going to do, It's actually typical measures, a mix of therapeutics like increased access to medications and also environmental changes like trying to change the flora in the local environment to reduce the risk and the exposure people have in inflaming their hay fever. However, it's again subject to that discursive and rhetorical creep that you might imagine with securitization. So now you have the language and it progresses. And if you go back to asthma for a second, if you consider the environmental drivers of asthma, for example, pollution and climate change, you can imagine that it's not that difficult a leap to see where asthma becomes, again, securitized, where there becomes a drive to shore up therapeutics for your tribe, let's call it, for want of a non-specific term, to protect your tribe against asthma. Increasingly again, adversarial, increasingly again, separate from each other. So the thing is that this isn't a particularly new idea. I mean, the definition of health by the World Health Organization's own constitution is that it is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So in many ways, I'm standing up here and I'm not really saying anything new, which is one of the worst things you can do at a conference. But I think it bears, putting my hand up on this one, if only to drive home how securitization and that creep of that narrative can overtake our goals of preserving and securing health. And in securing health, we drift away from protecting and enabling well-being and promoting the health of the people that we're trying to assist in the first place. We heard in the previous session, for example, about PEPFAR. And that's an example, again, where AIDS, a securitized disease, it had, for a long time, been ignored, not because the threat wasn't real, but because the perceived threat was not real. As far as they were concerned, the decision makers at the time, this was not an illness to be concerned about. This was something on the fringe. Again, 2 decades later, it's recognized at the turn of the century in the US as a security threat. But even then, there are strings, there are conditions attached to the treatment of the disease. Again, totally separate from the biomedical or inherent threat of the illness itself. Finally, to wrap it up, this is, there are further issues to consider here. This has just been a very, very broad and general kind of introduction to this. When we talk about well-being, maybe it's not so much of a stretch to kind of say that further discussions on this would include discussions of health equity and fairness when it comes to the distribution of healthcare, the distribution of resources, and the distribution of health outcomes. Not only that, but also the functioning and assumptions of the global population health metrics, or these population health metrics, which inform our understanding of burdens of health and the benefits of therapeutics. So in other words, what are the tools that we use to measure the impact of these illnesses? What are the inherent assumptions in there? What are we measuring? And who are we measuring it against? All of these things, they all deserve re-examining in the context of trying to, again, ensure that core of well-being. Finally, as well, we're speaking today a little bit on the global context, but there is that disconnect as well between domestic policies and global health promotion, especially when we look at how the discourse around global health and the theatre in which it is entertained, often outside of specialist arenas and often away from national kind of health strategies, etc. And finally, just to say thank you very much. I hope that was to your liking.
Thank you very much, Barry, for, again, another very interesting presentation. And I think you did bring something very new to this discussion, particularly, and it's reflected in all of the presentations today, this need for real critical dialogue about key issues in relation to security, and particularly human security. So thank you very much, and it has raised a lot of questions for me, and I'm sure a lot of others, and we'll get to those later. So finally, I'll introduce you to our third speaker, Dr. Mina Hosseini from University College Dublin. And just to give you a little bit of background to Mina, Mina is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at University College Dublin. She holds a PhD in competition law from Beshiti?
Yeah.
From Beshiti University in Tehran, Iran. Prior to joining UCD, she worked as an assistant professor at Tehran University of Science and Culture from 2018 to 2022. And during her time there, she taught courses in contract law, competition law, and tort law, and served as the academic manager of the USC Journal of Modern Technology Law. Mina's presentation today is entitled Building Global Solidarity in a Permacrisis, Lessons Learned from COVID-19 and Future Directions for a Pandemic Treaty. So I'll hand you over to Mina. Thank you, Mina.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here and delighted to speak about solidarity in a permacrisis and specifically about the pandemic treaty. Permacrisis refers to an extended or permanent period of instability and insecurity, especially from a series of catastrophic events. We are living in a permacrisis. Epidemics, pandemics, wars, humanitarian crisis, climate change, regional conflict, food security, poverty. And the most recent example of these crises is COVID-19. The political, economic, social, and health impacts of COVID-19 on our lives have been far-reaching and profound. Some examples of these challenges that we all are familiar with are global health solidarity, specifically in case of distribution of vaccines, pandemic profiteering, governance challenges, infodemic, and all the misinformation and disinformation spread on social media about COVID-19, disrupted supply chain, nationalism, specifically in distribution of vaccines, human rights challenges, and the pressure on health systems. To address global health issues, nations from all around the world should cooperate. The concept is known as global health solidarity. It means sharing resources, expertise, and data in part of enhancing health outcome for all. COVID-19 highlighted some inequality and shortcomings in global health solidarity, specifically in distribution of vaccines, diagnosis, and treatments, lack of effectiveness of some WHO programs such as COVAX, vaccine intellectual property issues, all the debates on IP waivers, compulsory licensing, and all the debates, all the lobbying on these matter, greater harm to disadvantaged and marginalized groups, specifically in global South, vaccine hoarding, which resulted more than 1 million deaths because of COVID-19, specifically because of these factor, vaccine hoarding, excessive pricing of health-related products, inadequate capacities, capabilities, power, and resources of multilateral institutions and mechanisms to enforce solidarity norms, and inadequate global cooperation and coordination. Disruption to essential health services, specifically in the global South. So what's the solution for all these problems? What's the solution for the next health crisis? COVID-19 is not the end of these health crises. WHO with member states are currently negotiating a convention, agreement, or other international instruments under the constitution of the WHO to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, and to secure and foster further collaboration in multiple areas that impact the health and well-being of people in communities, countries, and globally. So the question is, why do we need an international pandemic treaty? There are some arguments pro this treaty and some arguments against it. both from public and from different disciplines, scholars. Some believe that it's a chance to decolonizing international law, it's a chance to foster global equity, and a treaty would protect lives, livelihoods, security, and human rights. And another author believed that in an interconnected world, the fair sharing of vaccines is morally mandatory, and to break the pandemic cycle. But there are also some arguments against the pandemic treaty. Some scholars believe that it will be a failure because of lack of global cooperation in global health and lack of commitment to international law and norms generally and during the pandemic. There are also many arguments against the pandemic treaty. If you search the pandemic treaty hashtag in the Twitter, you can see lots of debates most of them based on conspiracy theory. Even in the national parliament, I saw a debate on the UK parliament last week about the pandemic treaty, and some member of the parliament arguing based on conspiracy theories. And they believe that some of the arguments against pandemic treaty, of course, are based on conspiracy theories, not all of them, but some believe that it will lead to a global health dictatorship. It will replace the constitution of every country. It will harm the sovereignty of states. So these international documents currently are in negotiation. It has started in December 2021, and WHO member states agreed to begin negotiation a global pandemic treaty, and it's continued with creation of a negotiating body, intergovernmental negotiating body, and also it will be finalized in May 2024. So what's now they're published a zero draft. They're working on this zero draft. It's not finalized yet, but what's in the zero draft? I create this picture using one of these apps. It's a word cloud of the zero draft. If you look at this picture, you can see that the most repeated words are health, prevention, preparedness, pandemic response, pandemic-related, global, parties, but not so many words on equity and solidarity. So in the preamble of the zero draft, it says that it's a catastrophic failure of the international community in showing solidarity and equity. It's true. During the pandemic, we saw that access to technology, access to know-how, access to vaccine for Global South was a huge problem. They were arguing that, no, in Global South, you don't have the infrastructure for vaccine production, so we don't share our knowledge, we don't share our technology, we don't want to waive our IP. So these zero draft are arguing and mentioning access to technology, promoting sustainable and equitably distributed production, transfer of technology and know-how, regulatory strengthening, WHO pathogen access, benefit sharing system, strengthening and sustaining preparedness and health system resilience, and protection of human rights. Specifically, the zero draft emphasizes that the parties recognize the need for equitable access to pandemic-related products, and will work to increase manufacturing capacity and promote technology transfer to capable manufacturers, particularly in developing countries. In pandemic times, mechanisms will be established to facilitate technology transfer. In the event of the pandemic, measures will be taken to support time-bound waivers of intellectual property rights to increase the availability of affordable pandemic-related products. But I don't believe that the pharmaceutical sector, the pharmaceutical industry, accept this provision. It may be subject to change because there are hugely lobby from the pharmaceutical sector in this matter. Also, whole of government and whole of society approaches at the national level, strengthening pandemic and public health literacy. Most of the debates on the pandemic treaty and many of the conspiracy theory is because of lack of public engagement from the negotiators and from the national government, and because of lack of transparency in negotiating. Governments must have public engagement, must have showed to their people that why this international document is necessary and why we are negotiating it. So another aspect of this treaty is One Health, connecting the health of humans, animals, and planet, an oversight mechanism including monitoring provision and accountability measures. So there are some legal aspects of the treaty, because I'm a lawyer, so from the legal point of view, this zero draft have some implications for global health governance, human rights, IP rights, competition law, and technology transfer, know-how, even tort law. The legal aspects of this pandemic treaty would depend, of course, on the specific provision regarding these issues. For example, the zero draft mentioned common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities in the pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response and recovery of health system, which is challenging. According to the zero draft, states that hold more resources relevant to pandemic, including pandemic-related products and manufacturing capacity, should bear a commensurate degree of differentiated responsibility. So the responsibility depends on the resources and capability of each state. In the same vein, the social needs of developing countries and vulnerable parties that do not have adequate capacities to respond must consider. Another legal issues that have a legal impact is disclosing information on public funding for research and the development of pandemic-related products. As you know, most of the vaccines during the pandemic was produced by public funding. Pfizer with public funding of US government, AstraZeneca with funding of Oxford University, which is a public body. And although they're using public funding, they weren't disclosed the prices, contractual terms, and sharing data, sharing technology was a huge problem during the pandemic. So it's a very positive aspect of the zero draft that specifically mentioned that if you're using the public money, you have to disclose terms, price, and contractual clauses with government. Another legal aspect of the treaty is suggesting a global compensation mechanism for injuries resulting from pandemic vaccines. So it will impact tort law. Until establishing such a mechanism, each party shall, in contract for supplying or purchasing pandemic-related products, endeavor to exclude buyer-recipient indemnity clauses or excessive duration. The pandemic-related products, vaccine contracts were extremely confidential, but there were some leaked versions of these contracts, and there were several clauses on this matter. We don't have any responsibility. We don't want to share our data. We don't want to. You don't share the prices and contractual terms. So this transparency approach of the zero draft is a positive point of this draft. Also, the zero draft recognizes the importance of protecting and promoting human rights in responses to pandemics. It acknowledges that pandemics can have significant human rights implications and emphasizes the importance of promoting transparency and non-discrimination and mitigating the disproportionate impact of vulnerable population. But there are also potential challenges in implementation of pandemic treaty. Many believe that it might resemble as international health regulation, ineffective to compelling the state to take action. And also, the legal format is under debate, which is also is not clear yet that it will be under Article 19 of WHO Constitution, a convention or agreement, or Article 21 regulation, or even Article 23, which is recommendation, just soft law. If the international pandemic treaty will be something like something soft law, something like recommendation, it will be a failure, in my opinion, of course. Also, in some articles, there are some subjects about although innovation in the pharmaceutical industry is so important for us, but solidarity is also important. So making this balance between innovation and solidarity is it will be challenging for implementation this pandemic treaty. Also, political support in drafting and ratification from member states is another issue, and currently there are some debates on the national parliament against this pandemic treaty. Another issue from a legal point of view is the language of the zero draft. In different articles, we see this expression. Governments should, they're encouraged to, they endeavor to, they can try. These are not really legal binding language. So the language of the zero draft is like a soft law, even though there emphasize that we prefer a binding international treaty. So it could be challenging for implementation of the pandemic treaty. So as conclusion, I believe that building global solidarity in a permacrisis is difficult, but may be possible. COVID-19 has many lessons for us, and we saw this vaccine nationalism, this inequity in distribution of vaccines and pandemic-related products, and intellectual property as an obstacle has huge impact on the lives of people, especially in Global South. So with a pandemic treaty and with some accountability mechanism and with a strong binding treaty, we could we might see that in the next health crisis, it help to act better. So as a conclusion, I want to read a poem for you from my favorite poem, a Persian poet, Saadi Shirazi. This poem is about solidarity. He says, human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is inflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot pertain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mina. And I think that was a wonderful way to end this session of presentations. What the presentations today have shown is both the planetary pressures and the precarities of our human world, and brought together the legal, regulatory perspectives, broad and specific perspectives on the need for global interconnectedness and ecological and health concerns. And what came across very clearly was this demand for greater solidarity and a reframing of key issues to bring about more holistic, inclusive, and equitable dimensions to human security. So I'm going to open the floor to questions now, but we'll have to make it very quickly. I've just been reminded by Vanessa. So, first question.
Hi, my name's Una Murray, and I just want to comment on Mina's presentation, and I loved your poem. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. But I think you've really highlighted that the process of negotiating a treaty in this case is very complex and very difficult, and the language is really, really important. And you've highlighted so many issues that have to be in place for something to happen, really. But I think that the question to ask really is transparency in the process, and it seems that there is some transparency in this new treaty. But the questions we should be asking is, how transparent are the non-governmental submissions? How transparent are the governmental submissions? Are the transcripts available for debate? And I think you also highlighted the importance of language again, that a treaty is no good unless it's ratified, and to be ratified, it has to be accepted nationally. So the language is really important, and lots of governments won't ratify if they will have to do things or shall have to do things or think about that. So I think you've really brought really important points to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yep, one more question here.
Just to Barry particularly, well, thank you to everybody for very interesting talks, but Barry was talking about earlier in the first part of your presentation, you listed a number of diseases which are presently, or in recent times have been of particular concern to people. You mentioned, one of the things you mentioned as well, condition of obesity, but I didn't hear you mention diabetes too, which I think used to be considered as related to it. However, you may have mentioned, I just missed it. I just saw an article the other day, browsing on the internet, that TB, tuberculosis, is coming back to be a real danger that it may be a scourge. And of course in Ireland, that's a very big thing to us because it was a scourge for so long until the late 40s or early 50s when we got a fairly radical doctor who became Minister for Health on his first day of the Dáil Mill Brown. And also the confluence of that and the emergence of new drugs helped to eventually control what had been a real thing in Ireland. Is this true that tuberculosis, it was only one article, and is TB on the rise again in Europe? It seems to be saying Eastern Europe, I think maybe particularly, that I'm not a medical person, I'm a lawyer like Mina, but
So I'm also not a doctor. I'm an official with the Department of Foreign Affairs in my day job. I can't speak specifically to TB, but I can say that it is true that a number of illnesses that had previously been considered either eradicated or on the sharp decline are again on the rise, not because of our inability to treat them medically, but because of distrust when it comes to medicine, when our distrust when it comes to authority in terms of doctors, in terms of politicians. So we're seeing a challenge for medical and kind of health challenges. We're seeing that the difficulty is actually not related to the health aspect or the medical aspect, but to that narrative once again. And it goes back partly to that idea of that combative narrative. And we saw this with COVID also. If you consider the rise of the kind of the anti-vaccine movement during that time and how much it was linked to one's own sovereignty and one's own individual rights and one's own right to choose how they would approach this, as opposed to a collective responsibility where we're all in this together, that defining it in that adversarial manner, certainly not the only cause, but didn't help.
Okay, if there's no further questions, I think we better wrap it up because we're under some time constraints here. So we're going to, are we taking a break now? Okay, yeah, there's a break in, but it's going to be, yeah, just to make sure we have plenty of time for the rest of the speakers. So 5 minutes? About 5 minutes, so